Welcome to the Sportsman's Workshop, brought to you by Chevy Trucks. The trucks you can depend on, the trucks that last.
If you have as much outdoor gear as I do, you need the right transportation. A truck you can depend on, one that lasts. Like this all-new Chevy Suburban, or the sporty all-new full-size Blazer, ready to tackle just about any off-road terrain. Blazer has available seating for 6, and Suburban lets you choose seating packages for up to 9, or 160 cubic feet of cargo space. And talk about towing. This super wagon has increased towing capacity up to 5 tons. Blazer's towing ability is increased too, and both give you standard 4-wheel anti-lock brakes for even more security on the road. You know, folks, it's hard for me to think of vehicles that suit today's sportsmen and sportswomen better than this new Chevy Suburban and Blazer. There's just nothing else like them. And when you head for home, remember to pack out everything you brought with you, including spent shells and old fishing line, and set a good example for others.
And now, here's your host, Jay Warburton.
As a young boy growing up in the plains of North Dakota, I used to think about how exciting it would be to be able to catch a largemouth bass. Sure, in that country there's northern pike and muskie and lots of panfish, but I remember reading in the magazines about the largemouth bass and how exciting it would be to catch one of those awesome fish of the South. Well, since those many years ago, I spent a good share of my life learning how to catch largemouth bass. And that's precisely what I would like to show you today. Over the years, the art of bass fishing has been refined by professional fishermen. One of these professional fishermen is a friend and colleague of mine, Roger Moore. And we are now going to go out to a favorite bass pond of mine and join Roger, where he is going to show you exactly where to find bass.
I guess I've fished for bass all my life, at least it seems like it. And I'm going to help you today by giving you some hints and some techniques on bass fishing. Remember this, bass is a structure-oriented fish. He hangs close to structure all the time. It hides his silhouette, and it also provides him a place to attack from. He's an attack fish. He will attack any food, anything that swims, minnows, shrimp, crawdads, anything that you can get out there to him. Now let's talk a little bit about the bait movement. Starting with the winter time, and we'll talk mainly about minnows at this point. They're in rather deep water. Now as the water warms up, the minnows will move into the shallow water, and the bass will follow them. They'll feed heavily. From there, they go to the summertime. The water is extremely warm. The bait fish will move back to the deeper water a little bit, and the bass will follow them back there for the summer. So then you'll have to look for a different type of structure. Seasonal bass patterns relate directly to water temperature. Largemouth bass prefer water approximately 72 degrees. Smallmouth, a little cooler. Remembering this, we think about the winter time. The warmer water is deeper, so the bass will be deeper. In the spring, as the water warms up, the fish move up into shallower water. The available food is shallow, they feed heavily, then they spawn, and after the spawn, the water becomes so warm that they again move back to the deeper water. During this time of the year, you'll really do your best bass fishing early in the morning and late in the evening in the shallow water. Now let's look more closely at some of these specific structures. Structure can be anything from a stump to a moss bed to a rock pile to a mound to a turn in a stream. Just any place that'll break up their silhouette or give them a place to hide. Since they are a predator fish, it gives them an ambush point. The back of a creek is usually the best place to fish for bass early in the spring because that's where the water warms up the quickest, and it's where the water has the highest oxygen content, and it's where usually there's the most cover available. Any place in the United States where you can find rocks in a lake or a reservoir or in a stream, you'll find crawdads, and where you'll find crawdads, you'll find bass because that's a basic forage for bass is your crayfish. Stumps are an excellent source of cover for bass. Any stump that you can see out of water that has at least a foot or so of water on it should have a bass on it if there's a population of bass in that lake. Anytime you can find a tree laying in the water, there should be a bass or two in it. Floating logs are a little bit different in that if you find a single floating log that is not attached to the bottom except by just one little end of it or something, anytime there's a wave action, that log moves up and down, the bass will come out from under it. But if you can find a log jam that's floating and all pushed into the back of a little pocket, you're liable to find several bass. Whenever you can find moss around the edge of a lake, if it's floating moss, there's usually an area underneath there and there'll be bass under there, but not many people seem to fish moss that's floating because they're in fear of hanging up. There's only a few lures that you can fish on a floating moss bed, but there really are a lot of fish under there. An underwater log or any underwater structure is better than a structure that you can see because it isn't fished as much. If you can find a stump bed that's out on a point and no one else knows about it, you've got an underwater source of structure that is superb. Anytime you can find a vegetation line that breaks off into sand or an open bottom, it's an excellent place to fish because the fish will get in that vegetation and attack bait as it comes by in the open water. You know, we've talked about a lot of different types of structure today. All of these types of structure, though, have been natural. We've overlooked one of the most effective pieces of structure for bass fishing, right behind me, a dock. A heck of a good place to catch a bass. It provides shade and it provides cover. So don't overlook a dock when you're bass fishing.
Fishing with live bait is one of the most consistently successful methods for catching bass that I know of. And one nice thing about live bait is that you can find it most anywhere in the country. There are a number of items that you need in order to become a successful live bait fisherman. Two of those items are a good rod-reel combination. I prefer to use the Shimano casting reel and a 5.5 to 6 foot Eagle Claw graphite rod. There are a number of other items that you need to take with you when you go live bait fishing. One of them is a good selection of Eagle Claw hooks. It is essential that you have a wide variety of hooks to choose from. The bait canteen is an essential item for keeping your bait fresh. You need a good variety of weights to choose from. You need some snap lock weights, you need some slip sinker weights, and plain ordinary weights. And of course you need a good selection of bobbers, snaps, and swivels. Let's go back to the pond and join Roger, where he's going to show us some special techniques for using the three most important live baits: night crawlers, minnows, and frogs.
One of the reasons I like to fish with live bait is it's a little less work. Now remember this, when you go to the local tackle shop or your local bait store to buy your bait, don't just buy one kind. Get worms, crawdads, minnows, whatever the available forage fish is or the forage for the bass, try to duplicate it. Natural presentation is very important to live bait fishing, and proper rigging is the key to natural presentation. Now let's take a look at some of these specific baits, starting with the frog. Take the Mr. Twister keeper hook, insert it in the lower jaw, come out through the upper jaw, and then let's take a little piece of used plastic worm, put it on the shaft of the keeper hook, put the point of it on the barb of the hook. Now we have a weedless live frog rig. This is for topwater fishing. Now when you rig this frog weedless, as soon as he hits the water, he'll bloat up full of air, so he'll float. If you want to fish the frog on the bottom, let's take a water gremlin snap lock sinker, snap it onto the line without having to untie your hook. It'll slide back and forth so the fish won't feel anything when he picks up the frog. Nothing will keep him from that natural presentation we've been talking about. For a night crawler, we'll use an Eagle Claw weedless wire guard hook and a water gremlin light slip sinker. Now we take the night crawler, lay him in the palm of your hand, and slap your hand. That way he won't jump around on you. It'll make it much easier to put on the hook. Take the hook, insert the hook slightly behind the point of the head, thread it on approximately 1 inch or back to the collar in the worm. Pull the hook out, slide the worm up on the hook to the eye, close the weed guard. Now you have a rigged night crawler for a very natural presentation. There are several ways to rig a live minnow. First, let's talk about still fishing. Take the minnow, hook the hook under the dorsal fin, but above the spine. If you get too deep, you'll kill the minnow when you go through the spine. Hook him this way, then he hangs in a natural position when he swims. Now to hook a minnow, and I'm just going to unhook this one for the sake of showing you people. If you're going to cast a minnow and retrieve it, hook him through the lower jaw up through the head. If I can get it here. Tough old minnow. There we go. Now when you cast and retrieve the minnow, he will swim very naturally if he's hooked this way, and he'll stay on the hook a long time. The other way that you can hook a minnow, a live minnow, for casting and retrieving is through the eyes. I use a bait casting reel for an awful lot of my fishing, and the correct way to handle a bait casting reel is with your hand turned parallel to the water, regardless of whether you're left-handed or right-handed. Your hand should be turned parallel to the water because when you make the back cast, your wrist will flex more in this position than if you hold it like this and try to flex your wrist this way. So always hold your hand parallel to the water. Then, to make the cast, you need to come back and go forward in one smooth motion and use your thumb to control the trajectory of your cast. You automatically cast farther than you want to go, and use your thumb on this reel, on the arbor gently, to feather your cast down at your object. Remember, we've been talking about structure and accurate presentation. This is exactly what this reel does for you. You know, fishing with the bobber really makes it a lot easier because you're able to see your strike. Another advantage of fishing with the bobber is that it keeps your bait out of the weeds and off of the bottom where you want it to be, where the fish are active. You can't make the snap cast with your wrist or you'll throw the bait off much of the time. Instead, you need to make what we call a roundhouse cast. Not a sidearm across the end of the boat or across down the bank where you'll hook someone, but a roundhouse over the top in a slow swinging motion. With a live night crawler, we're using a weedless hook and a slip sinker. The cast is the same as it is with the minnow on the bobber, not the snap cast. Once again, we use the roundhouse cast. Let the lure hit the water. Watch your line. As the worm sinks to the bottom, a fish may hit it. If he does, take up the slack and set the hook immediately. If he hasn't hit by the time the worm gets to the bottom, wind up the slack, then work your rod tip from 9 o'clock very slowly up to about the 12 o'clock position. Then, maintaining control of the line so you can still feel the worm, wind slowly back down to the 9 o'clock position. Anytime you get a strike with a live worm, a night crawler, you can set the hook immediately. He almost always has sucked that entire worm into his mouth. In our discussion of live bait, we've talked about fishing a night crawler on the bottom. We've talked about fishing a live minnow, suspended. Now we'll talk a little bit about fishing a live frog. We'll fish him on top. And when you fish the live frog, the less retrieve you make, the better off you are. Let the frog do the work. Use the roundhouse cast, slow, throw it out, let it hit the water, close the reel, and get ready. Now, one thing to remember, probably the best piece of advice I could give you when you're fishing live bait is to fish it all very slowly. Let the bait do the work for you. With artificial lures, you have to move the bait. With live bait, you don't have to. Now let's sum up our bait fishing session on bass with 3 tips. Number 1, take a selection of live bait to the lake with you. Number 2, move that bait as little as possible after you make the cast. And number 3, remember the overhand or the roundhouse type cast.
Fishing with live bait is a very productive way to catch bass. However, I like the excitement associated with using soft plastic lures and jigs. And because there's such a large variety of these particular styles of lures to choose from, I recommend using 2 different rod-reel combinations. For your heavier varieties, I prefer to use the casting reel and rod combination. For the lighter styles, I prefer to use a 6.5 to 7 foot Eagle Claw fiberglass rod with an open face spinning reel. Now, to help you make your choices of soft plastic jigs and lures, let's take a close look at Mr. Twister's selection, starting with twister tails. These come in several lengths and styles. They can be purchased, as you see, either with or without jig heads attached, and in many different colors. Also, you can get bare jig heads, floating and sinking, in different weights, to use with a variety of soft plastic lures. These Mad Dads are a soft plastic which imitate the action of a live crawdad. Buck and rubber jigs can be fished either by themselves or in combination with a piece of Mr. Pork, as Roger will explain later. The magic of marabou feather jigs has changed the art of bass fishing. The natural underwater action is very enticing to bass. And without a doubt, soft plastic worms are the most popular artificial bait for bass used by professional fishermen. So, make sure you have a large selection in your tackle box to choose from. This largemouth starter kit will introduce you to soft plastics for catching bass. And finally, Mr. Pork, to use in association with numerous lures. There are some secrets to using soft plastics that once you've learned will help you put some big bass on your stringer. Roger's going to show us some of his favorites, which once you've learned will really help you catch fish.
You know, jig fishing is one of the most productive methods that we know to catch bass. If you like fishing with marabou, fine. If you like fishing with rubber jigs and Mr. Twister tail type jigs, that's fine. Some things to remember: if you're fishing in the wintertime, we've talked about fishing deeper. Black is a better color in the winter. In the summertime, white is my favorite color. And in the springtime, I like yellow, and yellow is also probably the best color for smallmouth bass. Now, the way to fish the jig, and what we have right here, is a marabou leadhead twister jig with a little piece of pork rind on the back end of it, a Mr. Pork. And to fish this bait is to make the cast, close the bail, let the jig sink a few feet. Then start with a gentle pumping of the rod tip, up and down, just like it's a minnow swimming in an erratic manner. Up and down, rather slow. You have to give this lure the action with your rod tip. That's why you need to move it up and down. Whoops, there's a fish right there. Isn't that something? I guess once in a while you get lucky. This is not a real big fish, but it shows you that a lot of times a bass will hit a jig when it's actually settling to the bottom. And you'll feel that just a little peck. You know he has it. Just go ahead and set the hook. Well, he'd fit in a skillet. Best way to handle a bass is with the lower jaw. Get your thumb in the lower jaw, lock it open, remove the hook, release him back if you're not going to take him home to eat him. That's a marabou jig with a little piece of pork on the back end. Excellent summertime bait. Another favorite of mine for summertime is the rubber jig, the twister tail jig. You can see here I have a yellow one with a little black jig head with an exposed hook again. Same type of a cast, only on this particular bait, you have a curly tail that does most of the swimming action for you, so you don't really need to pump the rod tip. You can just swim it along with a steady retrieve. One of the few baits that's very effective with just a slow, steady retrieve. Both of these jigs, you need to fish fast enough to keep them off the bottom because you have an exposed hook which will hang up if you get into the brush or down on the bottom where you have a lot of rocks. And on both of these marabou jig and the rubber jig, the soft plastic jig, you'll notice that the strike is very seldom a hard strike. It's a very, very light strike, but you must set the hook immediately. You can't hesitate when you get that strike. As soon as you feel that little tap, set the hook hard. A crawdad is one of the most natural of all bait for bass. This is an imitation crawdad made out of soft plastic, made by Mr. Twister, and it's called a Mad Dad. Comes in all of the natural crawdad colors and is fished on a jig head. And the retrieve for this bait is a steady retrieve with a little pumping action like a crawdad going up and down off the bottom. Lift it up, let it fall back a little bit, lift it up, let it fall back a little bit, lift it up, and as you do that, the tail, that paddle-shaped tail, swims back and forth through the water just like a real crawdad. One of the newest bass baits is what we call a jig and pork. What it is a lead head jig with a bucktail or a living rubber tail on the back of it. You can mix the two or you can have them separate. In addition to that, we take a imitation pork frog, put it over the hook, and there you have what we call a jig and pork. This bait is fished in a unique way. It's fished with the rod tip. You cast it out, let it go to the bottom. An excellent spring bait. It imitates a crawdad. Let it sink to the bottom. You watch your line. When your line goes slack, you know the jig and pork is on the bottom. Now you work it with the rod tip from about 9 o'clock up to about the 12 o'clock position, very slowly. The least little strike, here again, very similar to your jig strike, you set the hook. You don't have time to wind down and set the hook. You just have to set the hook immediately. Bring it back in after you retrieve it about 15 or 20 feet. You don't need to fish it all the way back to the boat, just down through the rocks on the drop-off. Cast it out again, do the same thing. Just move down along the bank when you fish this bait. And it looks just like a crawdad on the bottom. The little tails on the pork frog imitate the pinchers on a crawdad as he moves backward through the water. You know, we've talked about soft plastic baits for the last few minutes now, and soft plastics are very good bass baits mainly because they're supple, they're easy to fish, and they imitate in a very, very real manner the forage that the bass feed on. So when you go into your tackle store, I've emphasized this before, but it's really important. Go in and look for something that imitates the type of food that the bass feed on in the lake you're going to fish on. It makes a lot of sense to try and duplicate their natural food pattern. The last bait I want to talk to you about here, in the way of the soft plastic, is a plastic worm. It's my favorite. I suppose I fish a plastic worm maybe 50 to 75% of the time. It's a springtime, summertime bait. You don't fish a plastic worm very much in the wintertime. It's fished very slowly, fished right on the bottom. Very important to keep a plastic worm on the bottom. Remember, you're imitating a real worm. And a real worm will go into the water, settle to the bottom, and then crawl along the bottom. That's exactly what you want to do with this bait. Now, there are a lot of different colors of plastic worms made, a lot of different lengths, and so forth. I'm going to try and give you some help just on the basics. What most people buy when they go to fish with a plastic worm. Probably what is considered to be the hardest bait to fish or to learn to fish for bass. Actually, it's very simple. It's just a very slow way of fishing. You can't fish a plastic worm fast. The most popular colors nationwide are what I have in my hand here: purple or grape, black, blue, strawberry red, and a natural chocolate color. But don't hesitate to try a lot of other colors. If you're in certain parts of the country, certain colors will work better than other colors. In the southwestern part of the country, you'll find that there's a lot of people who use a metal flake worm. In the south central part of the country, you'll find a lot of people using, on specific lakes, you'll find them using what they call a mean green worm. So that's why the manufacturers make so many different colors of worms. I have a purple worm here today, and this is probably the most accepted length of worm. This is a 6-inch phenom, or a curly tail worm. And we have here to rig it with a Mr. Twister keeper hook, which makes the Texas rig a very, very simple rig to understand for every bass fisherman. Take the shaft, insert it right in the head of the worm, and push it up a little bit, and pull the hook into the worm until it's completely buried. If you're using a curly tail worm, make sure that the tail of the worm and the point of the hook are in the same position. You know, it's really important that after you've got your plastic worm rigged, that it hangs like that. You notice how straight the worm hangs? If it was hanging on a crooked, it doesn't imitate the natural worm. Probably the most important thing with plastic worm fishing is the technique. Accuracy is not extremely important because the worm is completely weedless. Throw it out. If anything, try to throw past your object. You won't get hung up. Let it go to the bottom. When the lure hits the bottom, you'll be able to tell your line will go slack on the water. Then you start your retrieve by holding your rod slightly in front of you and work the rod tip from a 9 o'clock position very slowly up to about 12 o'clock. No farther than 12 o'clock. At any point between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock with your rod tip, you feel any type of resistance, stop. If a bass has picked it up, you'll feel him start to move a little bit. You'll feel a little movement. At that point, drop your rod tip, take up the slack, and set the hook hard. Come right back here, right back inside here, hard as you can. You must set the hook hard enough to pull the hook through the worm and into the bass's jaw. And then the fight is on. Let me show you a little something else on how to set that hook. I'm going to make another cast right towards the camera just to show you a little technique here. You'll notice the lure settling. Maybe you'll be able to see the lure when it hits the bottom. When the lure hits the bottom and you feel the strike, wind down, but just take up enough that when you set the hook, you maintain contact with the fish when your rod tip is in the power position, or about 10 o'clock. You want the line slack until the rod tip gets right here. That's where your power is in the rod. Don't wind clear out like this, because from the time you now set the hook, from here to here, you really haven't moved much line. All you've done is tighten the line up and the bass will spit it out. Try to set the hook with a little bit of slack in the line, not too much. You know, a bass boat has been a real boon to all bass fishermen. It's set up strictly for fishing. It's extremely wide, so it's stable. And the latest design hull for bass boats is the Deep V. This Ranger is 18 feet long. It has, in my estimation, the finest equipment that you can put on a boat. Has 2 aerated live wells. It's extremely comfortable in rough water, and it has casting seats on both ends and performs well with an engine of recommended horsepower. And that's a big thing to remember when you're buying your boat and your motor, is that you don't put a motor on that's larger than the manufacturer recommends for that particular boat. Some other things that are really important on your bass boat is a kill switch, and it should always be worn when your large engine is running. And it's very important that you wear a life jacket anytime your big engine is operating. You need a graph and a flasher both. The flasher more or less for locating your fish. Flasher is also called the depth finder. The graph is for actually charting bottom structure and charting the fish themselves. On a boat as big as this one, you really need a 24-volt trolling motor. This Ram 1550 has over 30 pounds of thrust and will last maybe 2 days without having to charge your batteries. So a trolling motor, I would say, is the next most important piece of equipment next to your boat motor and trailer. Another thing that you really need when you're fishing is an anchor. Once you've located a school of fish, an anchor mate will come in very handy for holding you on that particular spot, so you can catch as many fish as possible before you have to move on to another location.
If you're serious about your hunting and fishing, the Sportsman's Workshop Video Library is for you. Learn the techniques and secrets of pros like Roger Moore, Babe Winkleman, Larry Nixon, Chuck Adams, John Wooters, Bob Brister, and many others. There are over 20 titles in the series designed to help you improve your performance in your favorite sport.
Roger has just discussed with you the various equipment to be found on a good bass boat. One of those pieces of equipment he talks about is called a chart recorder. Now, what a chart recorder has done has turned bass fishing into a science that can help you catch a lot more bass if you'll take the time to learn how to use one effectively. Let's go over here and look at some charts that were made by a cheater graph recorder. Looking at this first chart, we can see the graph patterns made by a school of baitfish above the bottom structure. There's a second school of baitfish over here to the left of this mound. Since the baitfish are so close together, they create this large pattern. But close by these baitfish, you can see the smaller pattern made by individual game fish. There are also indications of other large game fish elsewhere in this chart. The pattern along here is the bottom structure. This particular bottom is fairly smooth, except for this large mound. However, on the right side of this mound is the indication of a shelf, which is perfect structure to hold bass. Along the surface, you see this continuous pattern made by the interference of prop wash. The second chart shows some completely different bottom features. On the left is a patch of grass or seaweed, while to the right of this are two trees. And if you look closely, you can see a good-sized game fish hiding in the tree. Elsewhere on the chart, there are numerous large game fish patterns which you should work. The last chart shows one more example of bottom structure. Here you can see a very uneven bottom with some small bushes over here on the right side. There are game fish at medium depths on this chart, and these appear to be somewhat smaller than the fish patterns we just saw. But along the bottom of this chart, you can see the patterns made by fish very close to the bottom structures. That's one of the great things about this cheater graph. It can clearly show you fish swimming right next to the bottom. Plugs, or crankbaits, have been catching bass for a long time. And Storm Manufacturing Company produces one of the finest selections of bass plugs to be found anywhere. Let's take a closer look at them. These lures come in a great range of colors and styles, so whatever is best for the fishing that you do, you will be able to find it from Storm Lures. A great example of a topwater plug or crankbait is the chug bug. This lure has been designed to take advantage of the fact that most topwater strikes occur quite close to where the lure first hits the water. So the chug bug lies horizontally on the surface, and when the lure is retrieved, the cup on front makes a popping sound to attract the bass. A second general style of plug that Storm makes is for intermediate depths. You'll often hear these called floating diving baits. One Storm plug of this style is the thin fin silver shad. As you can see, the diving bill on this plug is not as large as on the deep diver, so it stays at a shallower depth. Another popular style of plugs are the deep water diving plugs. These are used to go after the bass right down on the bottom. This wigglewort is a good example of a deep running crankbait. This lure has a bill in front for diving, so when it is retrieved quickly, it will head right to the bottom. Another floating diving bait that Storm makes is the Thin Fin XT. This is similar to the Thin Fin Silver Shad, except that it is smaller. What this lure does is it allows you to cast more accurately because of its size. It also includes rattles inside the lure so that it makes sounds underwater, attracting the bass. Roger is an expert at using crankbaits, both the floating and the sinking variety. Let's go learn some of his secret tips.
You know, fishing with plugs is certainly one of the most exciting forms of bass fishing. The main reason is because you don't have any trouble telling when you have a strike. I have a topwater lure here now. This is called a chug bug. It's very unique in that with two different types of retrieves, you get two entirely different actions. With a short jerking action of the rod tip, it'll move from side to side. And with a sharp twitch of the rod tip, it'll plop water or splash water because it's actually cupped on the front of the bait. You notice that I have the bait tied directly to the line with no snap. Most of my topwater baits I fish this way. One thing you need to remember is really important when you're fishing with a topwater bait is that when you make the cast and your lure hits the water, let it set for a minute until the rings move out maybe 3 or 4 feet. Let that fish get a chance to look at that bait. Then start with a plopping action, just from the rod tip. So when you pull it, little short twitches, it actually slops water. This is a very versatile plug, and another way you can retrieve it is just by short twitching your rod tip like this, and the bait will actually wiggle from side to side. So there's a lot of different retrieves, and that's a good thing to remember, not only with the topwater bait, but with your crankbaits also. Don't just do a steady, static retrieve. The fish doesn't see anything abnormal in that. Then when you twitch it just a little bit, and he comes up and explodes on that bait, probably the most important thing I can tell you about fishing a topwater lure is to hesitate just a second before you set the hook. Your hand-to-eye coordination is so fast that when that fish comes up, his mouth is still open. And as soon as you see the splash, if you set the hook, a lot of times you'll pull the lure right out of his mouth. So make like you're fishing at night. At night, you don't set the hook until you actually feel something. And that's a good secret to remember when you're fishing a topwater bait. Let me get that back in. Now we'll go to a little different type of a plug. Right here I have a, oops, here it is right here. A shallow running, what we call a crankbait. This is what they call a thin fin XT. The shape and the size of this little bait make it easy to throw on very light line, and the shape of it will keep it from flying off to the side on you for a straighter trajectory. On a crankbait, a couple of things to remember. Number one is that when you make the cast, be sure to try and vary your retrieve. Don't retrieve just a static, slow motion retrieve. Go ahead and jerk the rod tip, stop it. This particular bait, this little XT, has what we call practically neutral buoyancy. When you retrieve it and stop, it almost sets dead still in the water. And that fish will follow it, and when it stops, he'll stop. And as soon as it starts to move again, chances are he'll hit it hard. One thing about all of your plugs, or at least the majority of your plugs, most of them have treble hooks on them. One other thing with crankbaits, I like to try and match the forage that's available. Okay, make a little short cast with this, and I'll show you a little bit of that retrieve. You just let it set, retrieve it a little bit, stop. Retrieve it a little bit, stop. Twitch your rod tip, stop it a little bit. A lot of times with the crankbait, a fish will follow it almost to the boat before he hits it. So you got to be ready all the time. Okay. Now the third type of a crankbait we're going to talk about is what we call a thin fin silver shad. This is a little bit lighter bait. It's a little bit more streamlined, and this will tend to maybe move a little bit from side to side on you if you throw it into the wind. So it's kind of critical with this bait that you're able to throw downwind, or you're able to throw where your accuracy is not quite as important. Throw this into open water, throw it up on points, or throw it where you've got some a hump, a mound, or something like that. This bait, after you tie it on, it will, and you cast it out, it will tend to run a little ways. Then when you stop your retrieve, it'll float to the top on you. This is a floating bait, a floating diving. You see the short bill, it's a shallow runner. This bait I also prefer in kind of a minnow color. If I'm fishing it in very shallow water, I may go to a crawdad color. But basically my crawdad color baits are the ones that I use in my deep diving baits, and I'll show you one of those in just a minute. I'm going to tie this on here, but before I tie it on, one thing I'd like to tell you. You know, the weakest link in your fishing is in your monofilament line. Whatever else you take a shortcut in, don't take a shortcut in monofilament. A bargain in monofilament is the most expensive line you can buy. I'm going to show you how to tie a knot. Go through the eye of the lure, go right back through the eye a second time. Then you take the end of the line and wrap that line 5 times around the line coming from the rod. 4, 5. Then go right back through the 2 loops that you have formed at the eye of the hook. Pull it down. Now you've seen how we tie what I consider to be the best knot, the twice through the eye clinch knot. In order to determine whether or not you've got a really good knot, as you pull it down, make sure that each little coil wraps around the one in front of it, smooth. And pull it down tug on it a little bit. Make sure you got a good, smooth, tight knot. Then go to fishing with it. After you fish with it for about, say 45 minutes or an hour, you should do this regardless of whether you're in a lot of fish or you're in a lot of brush. Ever so often, take about the top 12 to 18 inches of your line and check it between your thumb and your finger. If you feel the least little nick in there, break your line and retie, because just a slight abrasion in your line will noticeably deteriorate the strength of the line. It'll really knock the strength down. So make sure that your line isn't frayed anywhere. One more little tip when you tie that knot. As you're pulling that knot down very slowly, you should wet it somehow. Either drop it in the water and get it wet, or wet it between your lips. That'll keep it from creating friction that'll break the knot. Okay, let's make a cast with this thin fin lure. We'll throw it out. Here again, it's similar than the retrieve to the Thin Fin XT we looked at a minute ago. You retrieve it down a little bit, shake it, pop it. Now when you stop this bait, it'll float back up. If you get hung up, rather than keep jerking on it, if you'll just let it set like that for a minute and shake it a little bit, chances are it may float back off of that stump and come back to the top for you. Okay, get that into the boat. I guess one of my favorite baits of all is a deep running crankbait. This is what we call a wigglewort. You notice it has a real long bill on it. It's tied to the line with a split ring or a snap, whichever you prefer. It has rattles in it. And my favorite colors in this bait are crawdad, because it's a deep runner, it'll dig along the bottom. And here again, a minnow color. If you fish in a lake that has a lot of perch or bluegill, that's a very good color in this with this particular bait. One other color, in real murky water, I like a bright chartreuse, or what we call a hot yellow color. Okay, make a cast here. Retrieve on this is a little bit different than the others. You crank it down real fast till you get it down to the desired depth. It'll run 8, maybe 10 feet deep, depending on how heavy a line you're using. Then when you get it down to that desired depth, you slow your retrieve down and try to hold it there. In the springtime, if you're fishing back in the end of a cove or a creek channel, you drag it down real fast till it hits the bottom, and then you retrieve it just fast enough to keep it bumping along the bottom. That way it digs up the dirt. It looks like a crawdad going along the bottom there. You know, I've probably fished crankbaits almost all year round. The only time I really don't throw crankbaits a lot is in the dead cold of the winter time, because then you need a very slow moving bait. And a crankbait is basically a faster moving, oops. Oh, we got off. Well, that's what I get. Can't catch them all. But crankbaits are very effective bait, regardless of what color you like, what kind you like. Just get out and throw a crankbait. Start fishing it in the springtime. During the summertime, fish it maybe in the middle of the day. Fish a deep running crankbait so you can get down to those deeper fish. Go to the back end of the creek where there's a fresh flow of water coming in, bringing in the oxygen. In the back of the creek is where your bushes are, and that's where your bait goes, and that's where your fish go. So when you're fishing crankbaits, be sure and try to fish them first thing in the springtime.
Let's take a few minutes to discuss spinnerbaits. They're an awful lot of fun to use, and they'll really catch bass, such as this bass hog made by Storm Manufacturing Company, and this buzzbait made by Mr. Twister. Now Roger's going to show you some of his special techniques that really work.
You know, there's a lot of different kinds of spinners that you can use for bass fishing. One of the most popular is what we call a single spin. This lure is called a bass hog with a single blade on a shaft that's rides above the lure itself. This has a plastic-coated, chip-proof head, and my favorite colors in this style of bait are white and chartreuse. Basically, I like the white color in the clear water and the chartreuse in the off color or the murky water. Blade size and color are very important also. This is a Colorado blade in what we call a hammered nickel finish. This reflects the very most light of any blade surface that's made. The other types of blades are the Indiana blade, which is also a teardrop shape, and the willow leaf blade. You just have to experiment with these different types of blades in the water that you fish. But this bait is very easy to fish. It's very weedless. You throw it out and immediately start your retrieve. Some people like to fish it so it's just barely below the surface. Other times you may want to fish it a little bit deeper. Some people even like to fish it right down the bottom with the pumping action. Lift it up, let it pump back down, let it fall down. Pump it up, let it fall back down. The bass will hit this bait pretty hard most of the time, so you don't have to worry about your strike. Most of the time you'll actually see your strike when you fish with this spinner bait. Another type of spinner, but still very different from the first one we showed you, is the Mepps Comet. Very popular in the northern part of the United States, but an excellent smallmouth bass lure all across the country. It's especially good in running water. Any place you have a stream or in a farm pond, in a big reservoir, it's excellent for all kinds of fish. It'll catch smallmouth bass, largemouth, white bass, crappie, just about catch any kind of fish that swims. But it is a very good bass bait. This has a bucktail tail on it and a little treble hook. It'll hang up a little bit more than your single-bladed spinnerbait will. This is fished on a very fast retrieve in shallow water and a rather slow retrieve when you're fishing in deep water. So you want to kind of match the retrieve to the type of water you're fishing. Now we're fishing a little bit shallow here, so I've got my rod tip high and I'm retrieving it a little bit fast because the water is so shallow. Okay, there we go. Another type of spinner is what we call an offset spinner. This is a Tweedlebug made by Mr. Twister. This is another bait that is just excellent for all kinds of fish. Not only a bass lure, but good for all panfish, rainbow trout, any kind of fish that swims will hit this little type of spinner, just like that little Mepps. It's very weedless. Just retrieve it a little ways, stop it, retrieve it a little more, and the fish sees the bait following the spinner, and they want to eat the bait. The last spinner I'm going to talk about is one that is in a category all by itself. This is a buzz bait. This is a combination of a spinner bait and a topwater bait. It's one of the newer bass baits. It's only been around for about the last 5, maybe 6 years. It's an excellent bait in shallow water. You really wouldn't fish a buzzbait very much over real deep water since you do fish it on top 99% of the time. There's a couple of tricks to fishing this bait, and one of them is that when you make the cast, as soon as the lure hits the water, you need to raise your rod tip to get it back to the top immediately, and then set up a very steady retrieve. You want this to go a very steady retrieve across the top, and as the lure gets close to the boat or to the bank, you'll slowly drop your rod tip to hold that same angle. Now when a fish hits this bait, it's very similar to the topwater chug bug we talked about earlier. You need to hesitate when you set the hook just a split second so you don't pull it out of his mouth. The best colors on this particular bait, as far as I'm concerned, I like a chartreuse and a white, just like the regular spinner bait that we talked about a while ago. I have a Mr. Twister piece of Mr. Pork on the back of this, and the reason for that is it makes it a little bit more buoyant. It'll come to the top a little bit quicker when you lift your rod tip. The other thing that this does is give it just a little bit more weight if you want to make that long, long cast. It's very weedless. You can throw it in any type of brush and get it back the majority of the time without ever getting hung up. An excellent bass bait, especially in the springtime and in the warm part of the summer, very early in the morning, late in the evening, and if you're a night fisherman, it's a superb night bass bait.
Being successful makes fishing a lot more fun. And since those early days in the North Dakota plains, I've learned to become a very successful fisherman. And if you use the techniques and equipment that Roger and I have talked to you about today, you too can have a lot more fun fishing.
If you're gonna go hunting and fishing, you know your Ford just may not do. You need a Chevy to get you out there and to bring you home when you're through. If you're gonna spend time fishing or hunting off deep in the woods, I wouldn't put keys in the ignition unless there's a Chevy underneath that hood. And 'cause my Chevy is built for the highways and built for the backcountry, it'll get you out on the byways and home as easy as a 1,
You know, fishing is very rewarding for several reasons. Number one, I think it's really nice to get out on the water and see the world come alive at daybreak. And then being out there again in the evening when the outdoor world wakes up again. But I think maybe for me, the most important thing about bass fishing is that we fishermen are unique in that we can go out and conquer our quarry, get him in the boat, look it eye to eye, and release it alive to catch again another day.
Drifting along while I'm singing this song, and I'll be here for days at a time. Good morning, sunshine. Good evening, starshine. I feel all my burdens slip away. The breeze is refreshing, and fishing's a blessing. I pack all my troubles away. I'll think of you when I look across the blue water. Be here for days at a time. Wishing that you were here with me too, 'cause I'll be here for days at a time. Yes, I'll be here for days at a time.